Good evening. Sorry to keep you waiting. Thanks for being here. My name is Stephen Collins. I'm the CEO of Matter, and tonight we have what's going to be a really interesting Tales from the Trenches program. For those of you who've been here before, this is a roughly monthly series where we interview really interesting entrepreneurs who've done interesting things in healthcare and really talk about their journey along the way, the companies they've built, and the lessons that they've learned. Tonight, we have two really interesting people. So the moderator tonight is somebody who'll be familiar to anybody in the room who's been to a number of these. So Rishi Shah, who used to moderate these all the time. For the last 6 months or so, he's been a little busy with with some developments in his company. He is now the chairman of Outcome Health, and I think the company is on a sort of rebuilding trajectory, and it'll be really interesting to see kind of how that rebuilding process goes. So he's been through certainly some of his own trenches, and so at one of these in the near future, I will put him back in the stage and interview him about kind of what that journey has been like over the last 6 to 12 months and a lot of the lessons that have come through that. But in any event, we're really happy to have him back tonight doing the moderation. And he'll be interviewing Dr. James Malt, who I think is one of the most interesting people in healthcare today. He's been kind of involved in connected health since before, kind of long before connected health was really a thing. Kind of built and sold 5 companies. He sold them to companies like Microsoft and Qualcomm, taken companies public, is a surgeon, or at least, I don't think he's a surgeon anymore, but at least trained as a surgeon, even if he's not doing operations at the moment, but a really interesting guy. Today he's the Chief Medical Officer of Qualcomm Life and is really in the center of a lot of what's going on in connected health. So please welcome Rishi and Dr. Malt, and I think it's going to be a great conversation. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Just kidding. To ask a question, and also for those of you who are watching online, go to matter.socialqa.com. Rishi will have the iPad and will moderate through the questions. So with that, please welcome Rishi and Dr. Malt. Thank you.
So first off, it's good to be back, and Stephen's absolutely right. I've had a whole host of tales from the trenches from the last couple of quarters, and I'm excited to talk to you all about them. But tonight we're going to have a really, really exciting conversation with James here, and I'll tell you, I always like to dig into the early childhood through kind of like the current moment, through what are our guests going to do next, and dive deep into all of those elements. But any of those three, we could blow through our full hour here on with James. I felt like when I was doing my pre-interview prep, it was like a most interesting man in the world commercial. So I'm just going to dive in. I won't do too much of the talking here tonight, but James is really a visionary. I can conclude that. In fact, the first vision he had was in the 3rd grade when he said, hey, I'm going to be an astronaut or a heart surgeon. One of those two became true. And he wrote John Glenn a letter about it. So I'll start there, James. You're in Cleveland. You're growing up. You started a bunch of things. Tell us about that chapter of your life a little bit here.
Well, I guess it's dreaming big. And as a kid growing up in the '60s, the space program captured my imagination, like a lot of kids, and many of us dreamed of someday becoming an astronaut. And I figured I'd be proactive about it. Let John Glenn know 9 years ahead that I needed a nomination from him to go to the Air Force Academy so I could become a jet fighter pilot, which in those days was necessary in order to become an astronaut. It was all very logical to me. But then by the time 6th grade came along, the whole bubble had burst because I suddenly got glasses. And in those days, you couldn't be a jet fighter pilot if you didn't have 20/20 vision. And there went the whole astronaut thing. And so by the time I was in 7th grade, I decided if I can't be an astronaut, I might as well become a heart surgeon someday. So there you have it.
And there were a couple of things that James, you started around then as well that stayed with me. Your first business was in junior high school, and then maybe you'll tell us about, you're wearing blue and yellow here, and we've got the Michigan Loyola game coming up.
Oh,
had a full,
are there any Loyola fans in here?
Right, okay.
Oh, good.
Well,
I brought props.
I know.
Let's see. Let's see. I'll use your iPad here.
Go hold it
Nobody
up.
minds these water bottles here. I'm glad you brought that up. Thank you.
Here, let's put the iPad on it.
There we go. Okay, good. I feel better now.
And you got a full ride. You run the football team at Michigan. So why don't we
Yeah,
cover those two next?
Well,
just having him on the stage, right? He's,
when I was when I was in 7th grade and decided I couldn't be an astronaut, I might as well be a heart surgeon. Of course, growing up in a little town outside of Cleveland, I went to the town doctor, and his name was Doc Mahoney, and said, "Doc, I think I want to be a heart surgeon someday." And he said, "Your timing is perfect." This is in the late 70s. He said, "We're starting to think about," he was the team physician for our high school, and he said, "We're starting to hear and think about having an athletic trainer tape ankles for the football team. Is that something you're interested in doing?" Okay, sounds good to me. And so they sent me to these sports medicine classes at Case Western Reserve, which were graduate program level classes, and I was in 7th grade. And so I dissected my first cadaver when I was in 7th grade, and suddenly I was in love. I knew I wanted to be a surgeon. And for better or worse, by the time I was in 10th grade, I was an instructor for these programs and developed a predictive analytics program for identifying athletes who were at risk for injury. And I built a little business going around to local high schools, then universities, then actually the Cleveland Browns adopted this program. And that put me in a position to be recruited by Michigan, Ohio State, Notre Dame to be an athletic trainer. People don't realize that you get full scholarships not only for being a top athlete recruit, but also the guys that tape the ankles. You got to keep those athletes on the field, and hence that's how I ended up at Michigan.
Now, look, as all the entrepreneurs and all the innovators in the room know, doing anything, you're gonna go through tough periods. And here you are now in college, and you had your own kind of, a battle with a little bit of tragedy, and it actually led you into some more opportunities and into a relationship that, say, changed your life. So tell us.
Yeah. So out of every cloud, hopefully there's a silver lining. My first day of college. And I graduated a year early because I knew I wanted to be a surgeon, and it's a long road, so I combined my junior and senior year of high school. So I started in Ann Arbor at 17, and you have to go early for, when you're a trainer, the football team starts preseason conditioning actually in early August. So my mom drove me up to Ann Arbor, dropped me off, and we were starting preseason conditioning the next day, and that night I got the phone call, and my dad had died of a myocardial infarction, of a heart attack. So, that was pretty tough. I had to get a job to pay for school and help support my mom. Basically did one season as the trainer, and walked up and down the halls at the University Hospital in Ann Arbor, and ran into what has become my second father and one of the most prolific surgeon entrepreneurs in the world. And so he inspired me and showed me tremendous opportunities. I started working as a technician in the intensive care unit with all these magnificent gadgets and bedside monitors. And he had invented a device in his garage in the mid-'70s, took that device from his garage. He was a heart surgeon himself, Michigan graduate, and then trained at the Brigham. And he took this device out of his garage and applied it to a newborn baby. These are in the days where there wasn't a lot of informed consent. And and that baby was within minutes of death, just after birth, from something called a meconium aspiration syndrome, and it saved this baby's life. She's alive today in her late 40s with 2 almost adult children, and today that device itself is in the Smithsonian Institution, and he has saved literally millions of newborn babies. It's something called ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, and his name is Dr. Bob Bartlett. Yeah, I mean, it's just, it's magnificent to have that inspiration and that mentor that creates those opportunities.
Now you were in school, you graduated, you went on to medical school, but you also started your first company and sold it during this period of time and got the inspiration for your second. Tell us a little bit about that.
So again, Bob was, the honest truth is we built this device that could make measurements in the intensive care unit that had never been made before. And one of my jobs as a technician was to wheel this device around. It would actually measure how many calories a patient was burning. And again, this was back in the early 1980s. We didn't really know how many calories someone was burning when they were on a ventilator in the ICU. And so we would just take our best guess. And they were just laying there. You wouldn't expect that they would be burning that many calories. But for the first time, we were making these measurements, and lo and behold, they'd be burning 4,000 calories, and I started keeping track of the fact that they were only getting 1,000. And that's just in one day. And I started adding it up for 3 days, 4 days. They'd be 10,000 calories in a deficit in less than a week. And you start thinking about it, how would we feel as healthy people, being in a 10,000 calorie deficit in 1 week? We probably wouldn't be feeling so good. And here this person just got hit by a truck and has got all sorts of traumatic injuries, and they're trying to heal. So it created an opportunity to make some clinical correlations. And it turns out, this is my first miraculous observation, if you starve patients, they don't do as well. And I started my career on that, and I realized, wouldn't it be nice if we could, well, I published that data. I was 19 years old, on stage, again, Dr. Bartlett, instead of most of these professors, they tend to take credit for the work that their teams do, and not this guy. He literally put me up on stage, in fact, Chicago at the Drake Hotel. I still remember, was my first big presentation for the Society of University Surgeons, and he was sitting there right in the front row. I thought I was going to wet my pants, and gave this presentation and said, everyone, you should know you're starving your patients, and we measured it, and we know. And what happened is, after the presentation, all these clinicians were coming up to the stage and saying, where can we buy one of those devices? There you go, business opportunity. So we decided, well, the first thing is, well, just get some glue and all this tubing, and you can build one. And nobody wants to do that. So that's kind of the necessity is the mother of invention. It really does hold true. But I think it comes around if there's a business need and a business opportunity, that has to match up with your idea. Right. And for better or worse, that worked out, and it helped pay some bills for medical school and so forth. So.
Now you're kind of fast forwarding. Tell us about then going to medical school, right? You're itching with ideas, and I was talking to Stephen a little earlier, and we both wondered about your perspective as a physician entrepreneur, right? There's a lot of school there. You went on to Duke. You did your fellowship, and so you kind of juggled both at the same time. How did you do that? And tell us a little bit about what med school was like with your second venture there?
Well, medical school was really, it was interesting because I had started working in the intensive care unit as a technician at the age of 17. So by the time I went to medical school, I honestly had a lot of stuff already pretty well covered. Pharmacology, physiology, I was going to the operating room literally, every day whenever I wanted to. So medical school, I had a lot of unusual kind of background before starting medical school. So it made it easy for me to skip class. And it's funny, I'm very involved in something called the Consumer Technology Association, which runs the Consumer Electronics Show. And the CEO is a guy named Gary Shapiro. Anyways, when I first met Gary pointed out that his wife went to medical school at Michigan as well, and it turns out his wife was one of my classmates, and we were just together the other day at a board meeting, and she reminded me, we were at dinner, and they were talking about us going to med school together, and she said, yeah, but none of us ever knew that guy because he never came to class. So again, I don't tell a lot of people this, but we had an amazing arrangement in medical school during our day. We had a scribe system that would take notes from every class, and every student in our class would actually contribute $100 per semester to the scribe service. Well, we had 200 students, right? So 200 students times, so we had 20 grand to pay. We literally paid a medical transcriptionist to come to every class, and at the end of each week, we'd have typewritten transcript of every class, including illustrations, and the professors would actually review them for accuracy. So I knew, and then we had one 8-hour exam every 4 weeks covering all of our classes. So I had it down to a science. I could be gone for 21 days, and then I'd show up for 9 days, read all of my class notes, take this one-day exam, and then I'd be gone again. So I was kind of, I did the med school by remote.
That's quite a system,
version.
right?
Allows you to create companies on the side.
Now, one of the things that's interesting, and we won't talk about all 80 today, we'll talk about a few, is you have over 80 patents. And so you had all these ideas in medical school, and a lot of people have ideas, but you did something with it, and you thought, we were chatting, boy, a patent's expensive, it's $10,000. How do I file all these patents? I'm in med school. So how did you do that?
Well, we didn't talk about this, but the impetus for that was a very painful lesson. So I did have what was a pretty cool idea, built a device. I didn't, but I formed a partnership with a friend that built it. And we ended up showing it. I won't name the company, but it was an early lesson. Showing it to a company. The company loved it. It made a lot of sense. We started spending a lot of time with this company, teaching them about the market and the technology. We went out. I'll tell you, they were in San Diego, but it wasn't Qualcomm. This was in the early 80s. We went out and negotiated a license agreement. My partner and I had a celebration dinner in San Diego. I flew back to Ann Arbor. I'm not making this up. Stopped at the Porsche dealership on my way home, and I put a down payment on a 944 turbo Porsche because I had this amazing license agreement that was going to be signed in a big check, in the next 2 weeks. 2 weeks went by. no check. And it got strangely quiet. I wasn't hearing from these guys. And so I pick up the phone. I say, hey, Bill, what's going on? I think you need to talk to Mike. Okay, Mike, what's going on? I think you need to talk to Pete. And finally got to somebody who said, we loved your idea, but we've decided instead of turning the rotor to the right, we're going to turn it to the left. And thanks so much for helping us figure this out. And that was very painful. I obviously didn't get my Porsche. And that really became a lesson for me, is you've got to be thinking about protecting your idea in some fashion or barriers to entry and kind of proprietary protective measures. So one night, and again, I had trouble sleeping one night, and I think about a lot of stuff in the middle of the night because I don't sleep much. And I had an idea, and I thought, I'm not telling anybody about this until I talk to a patent attorney. So I went to a patent attorney in Ann Arbor, and the patent firm was called Crass & Young. And it was a branch office. Crass & Young was one of the largest firms in the Detroit area. And I told this junior partner my idea. And a couple weeks later, they called back and had done a patent search. Back in those days, there was no internet, so you couldn't do a patent search online. Somebody had to look it up in the patent office. And anyways, they came back and said, this looks really novel. We think it's a great idea, and you should file a patent. And I said, oh, that's great. How much? And they said, oh, well, about $10,000. And funny enough, my tuition for med school was $8,000. And so I was going, I better stick with med school. So I ended up telling them, I couldn't do it. About 2 weeks later, I got a phone call out of the blue from some guy named Alan Crass. And I was like, Alan Crass, Crass & Young. So this is the senior founding partner of the largest patent firm in Michigan. And he called me up. He said, I've never done this before, but I think this is such a great idea. I would be willing to file all your patent work in exchange for a percentage of anything that came out of it. And from that moment through today, he's been my business partner. And anytime I had an idea, I had this outlet and just started filing one patent after another. And it really, really, became a portfolio on which to build all these cool little things.
Now you also became a consultant in medical school for a group of investors in Switzerland looking at some technologies. Tell us about that. How did that happen? And did you see anything interesting you still remember?
Yeah, actually, it ended up coming to fruition very nicely. It was right at there was kind of a pivotal event in world history. The Berlin Wall was coming down in the late 80s. And there's this tsunami of technology and crazy ideas coming out of the Eastern Bloc once the Berlin Wall came down. And as you can imagine, a lot of crazy ideas and a few really good ones. And a lot of people were coming to the Swiss government looking for seed funding for their idea. So they had to hire people who could be objective perspectives. And so I would fly to Zurich, sit down for 8 hours and have 2-hour presentations back to back from mostly crap coming out of the Eastern Bloc. But every once in a while, it was dazzling. And we managed to snag a couple of these, and one of them we turned into actually a drug development company with a very novel chemical process for adding glucose moieties to compounds that had really exciting pharmacological potential, but the pharmacokinetics, the solubility and so forth was not favorable. But if you started adding glucose moieties, anyways, the long and the short of it is that ended up becoming another company that we spun out called Glycosin, and then that was acquired by a pharmaceutical manufacturer. But I don't talk about that.
And so now we'll fast forward a little bit, right? So you get a sense of all of these adventures that James has going on, and there's a lot more that we didn't even cover, I'm sure. And then the first company I think you shared that really was at scale, right? That you took public was around this product, HealthyTech.
Yeah. So
tell us about, where were you when you said, okay, I'm going to go start this company? Set the scene there.
So actually, the inception of this was back when I was in medical school, and I had what I thought was a really, really important kind of novel concept, and filed that early patent.
Right.
That was actually back in the late 80s, and had that partnership with my patent attorney. I was a resident at Duke doing general surgery and cardiac surgery, and that was pretty consuming during that residency time. So I ended up licensing the patents to a small company down the street here. Anybody hear of Abbott Laboratories?
We might even have somebody from Abbott. Anybody?
There we go. And so we did a license agreement with Abbott to build this device in the early 90s. But again, having my patent attorney as my business partner, we negotiated a pretty shrewd license agreement that had minimum performance criteria, and we took a very nice upfront license fee, and I wasn't a struggling resident as were most, but we basically had performance criteria such that if Abbott couldn't build it and bring it to market, then the rights to all the intellectual property reverted back to me. And they had a 5-year window to reach basically a level of commercial revenue. The reality is the idea was way ahead of the technology to actually build it. And if you're not familiar with patent law, it turns out you can have an idea that is patentable, but is not necessarily something that you could build in today's technology. So it happened that the sensor technology and the processor technology to facilitate this concept just wasn't there yet, and Abbott wasn't able to build it. And so all those rights came back to me in the mid-90s. I finished my residency at Duke, went out to Colorado to do heart and lung transplants on the faculty at the University of Colorado. And by that time, both the sensor technology and the processor technology had progressed. I went back to my Swiss friends and got the initial $1.5 million in seed money. And during that time, the folks at Abbott had introduced me to a guy named David Kelly and his brother Tom Kelly. Anybody know this name? The group called IDEO. And IDEO in 1998 built this device for me, did all the design engineering, and it was a wonderful experience. If you've never heard of or met IDEO, I highly encourage it for every innovator, entrepreneur. They really are kind of the pioneers of kind of innovation, ideation, and it was just a blast. Ended up building a working prototype, and then went to prospective customers, and I've always, you have to be able to convey your vision and your passion, show them the market opportunity, and then get them excited enough to want to be a part of it in some way, either in the funding of that or in kind of the strategic rollout. So you want to, as much as possible, have kind of downstream revenue opportunities already secured as you're building it.
Right.
And so that company ended up being another little company called Procter & Gamble. And Procter & Gamble was quietly creating a weight loss dietary supplement system to compete with Slim Fast, which was going gangbusters in the late 90s and the turn of the century. And this device actually measures precisely how many calories your body is burning per minute, per hour, per day. It measures something called oxygen consumption and CO2 production. If you watch the Olympic videos where they're running on a treadmill with this thing strapped to their face, that's what it's trying to measure. What I was able to do is to reduce it down to a handheld device that was self-calibrating, and this ended up in every Bally's Fitness Club and every Jenny Craig, and you can still pay $50 to get your metabolism measured. But Procter & Gamble became an anchor investor in my second round, and it was a $10 million round. The key is having strategic investors anchor your round, because they're much less valuation sensitive, because they have a strategic interest in your idea, and they're not doing it just for a pure, financial return in a 3 to 5 year window. So they anchored the second round and ended up doing a third round. The third round was supposed to be a $20 million round. Ended up in a situation where a couple of very prominent high net worth people took a very strong interest in this and wanted to give me $40 million, and I only needed 20. And he put his arm around me and he said, "Jim, let me give you a little piece of advice." And this is, I can't name him, but he was the founder and CEO of at that time, the largest hedge fund in the world. And he said, "Let me give you a little piece of advice. I've never met a company that went out of business because they raised too much working capital." And that's a good lesson, because no matter how much you think you'll need, it tends to need more to get you to the finish line. And we ended up taking this device through the FDA and then taking the company public in the worst IPO market in 2002. This was after the dot-com bubble burst. But one other piece along the way, IDEO introduced me. We needed a software system to work with the device, and IDEO introduced me to a woman named Donna Dubinsky. Anybody know these? God, all these names are fading. She was the founder with Jeff Hawkins of a company called Palm, and this is a Palm Pilot. Ooh.
And it still works.
Do any of you how many of you have never heard of Palm? Okay, all right, you're not that young yet.
There's somebody there.
Semi there. Have you ever held a palm? You have no idea what this is. All right, good to know. This is what's called a PDA. Anybody remember that? PDA. Personal Digital Assistant. People forget about this. We're all walking around with these. Oh, the fruit company, didn't they invent? No. 1997, Palm Pilot. So it turns out IDEO actually completely designed and engineered all the Palm Pilots for Donna Dubinsky and Jeff Hawkins. And this was the first connected health platform that had a health app on a mobile device that would allow diabetics and other people to track and monitor their glucose and their nutrition, and then it would synchronize with a serial cable to a desktop computer. And then this thing in 1999, a guy named Mark Andreessen, anybody else, had left Netscape and started a company called LoudCloud. And we built the first web application that would allow clinicians to track and monitor patients using mobile devices. And this was 20 years ago this year. So we've been doing connected health for 20 years, people. It's just a better version now that it's wireless.
So we'll come back to some trench stories from Healthy Tech, but we've got a couple more companies, so we've got to keep going. And so you now are running this public company. You take it public. It's 2002, the last IPO I think you mentioned, and you ultimately decide, hey, I don't want to quite do this. So tell us about that a little bit, and then what did you do right after? It didn't take long for you to.
It was mutual between me and my board at that point, but that's another story. So again, a lot of these things are from personal experiences. So in 2003, my mother was diagnosed with Parkinson's and essential thrombocytosis, and she was still living alone in Cleveland. I'd be in the operating room, and they would call me from the Cleveland Clinic saying, hey, I just saw your mom, and I'd say, okay, what do you think? And they'd say, well, da-da-da-da, and I'd say, thanks for calling, I really appreciate it. I've got my elbows, and I'm elbow deep in somebody's chest, and by the way, have you talked to the other two doctors at the Cleveland Clinic who are also taking care of my mom? No, sorry, I don't know who her other doctors are. So I was my mom's care coordinator, as many of us have experienced even today. And it's hard, and I'm a cardiac surgeon, and you're basically shuffling information between a bunch of doctors who have no idea what each other is doing. And so that was the inception for I went back to IDEO, and IDEO was also the designer and engineer of an earlier generation of something called the Health Buddy, which was a company created by Steve Brown and Health Hero Network. Steve and I were actually introduced to each other by IDEO and became really good friends. Steve was actually best man at my wedding. And so I had the idea of taking that concept. I was, at that time, the new CEO of the nemesis to Randy Kellogg's Omron over here. And it was a company that was building blood pressure meters for the retail market. We created a joint venture entity to build out a new version of the Health Buddy and a software system for remote patient monitoring, and then created basically a service with nurse case managers based in Orlando, Florida, a group called Connections Health, which was acquired by United Healthcare. Now, if you get a phone call from United Healthcare, it's actually nurses at Connections. And we created basically a turnkey solution and then did a deal with CVS, so you could go online at cvs.com, buy one of these devices, which has a 14.4 baud modem. See, back in the day, there were these things called a modem, and it used to make this sound, and then it would connect to the internet. And sorry, I'm just being. But and then it would essentially take a care management system for heart failure, diabetes, deliver a survey every morning. Those answers would go back to the cloud, and then we had a nurse case manager who would monitor your mom, your dad, anywhere in the country for $50 a month. And we launched that in CVS in the summer of 2006, and within 12 weeks, we had some interesting pieces of paper from Intel, GE, Philips, and this company called Microsoft, who all wanted to get into the remote patient monitoring business. And 2006 was kind of the year that all the big players woke up to this inkling of digital health.
Right.
And
what did it do exactly, by the way, for folks that aren't as familiar?
the Health Buddy?
Yeah.
Well, it was really designed, again, by IDEO, just brilliant ergonomics for someone who's elderly or frankly, disabled. 4 big giant buttons that you could hit with an arthritic knuckle to answer yes, no, 1, 2, or 3, and it would be a survey tool. How do you feel today? Good, not so good, really bad. Do you have any shortness of breath? Yes or no. Do you have any swelling in your ankles? Yes or no. And then those answers with that modem would be sent back up to the cloud, and then the nurse case managers would be able to apply a rules logic, exception management to 2,000 patients. So we had a system that would allow one nurse case manager to be able to manage and monitor hundreds of diabetics, heart failure patients, COPD patients simultaneously on a day-to-day basis. So again, you have to look at the kind of the economics and the business model. Today, a nurse case manager, in the traditional approach, has to call somebody, and it's a 20-minute phone call. Well, you can calculate the labor cost and the hardware and the benefits and the fully burdened cost of a 20-minute phone call, no matter who you have doing it, is going to be somewhere around $30, even more now.
Right.
And in an 8-hour day, one nurse case manager with a 20-minute phone call, you can do the math. It's about 20 calls a day or 100 calls a week. And with something like this, remote patient monitoring could literally monitor 1,000 patients a day for the same nurse case manager. So you really flip the cost curve, and that's when you really have a business opportunity.
So, and we can dive in detail here, but, the non-fruit company from Seattle comes knocking, and you had an interesting arrangement with them as well.
Sure.
Tell us about building something inside Microsoft, right? And then tell us a little bit about, what led you to the company you sold most recently, because
Sure.
Microsoft was a part of that as well.
So Microsoft obviously got very excited. They had already acquired another company called Zixi, which was a very cool technology out of the MedStar hospital system. So they were kind of on a roll, had a mandate from Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer to build out this digital health capability, and we were kind of the second target of that effort. The getting into the device business and the FDA regulated world was something Microsoft was a little squeamish about. So our first project became the development of the first cloud-based health record system called Health Vault. And John and I were very deeply involved in creating that system. This little company called Google was also developing a competing version called Google Health at the time. But it was fun. And there's no real competitive. They used to get me on stage with Missy Krasner from Google and see if we were going to brawl or something. But it was always, we all knew we were in this together trying to pioneer a new category. It started to become clear to me pretty quickly that there's two sides to the equation when it comes to digital health. And we were building the consumer side, the consumer-facing side, but very quickly it was apparent that we needed a companion system on the provider side.
Right.
For doctors and pharmacists and nurses to be able to exchange that data with consumers. So I got the green light to create a joint venture company while I was at Microsoft. It was codenamed Project Denver for the first year. And then in the fall of 2009, actually I was here in Chicago I like building things with prospective customers along the way, and then once you build it, then they're ready to pay for it. It's kind of nice. So the American Medical Association, right down the street here, where their old office used to be, was the first licensee of the HealthyCircles system for the H1N1 swine flu crisis in the fall of 2009. So it was actually programmed with the CDC guidelines and launched.
What did HealthyCircles do exactly? What was its?
So HealthyCircles was truthfully a software version, kind of the next extension of the concept of creating these surveys, but now we could do it online. We had this internet thing, and we had wireless devices and mobile phones, and so now we could deliver those surveys right onto a phone and then a tablet, and allow that data to come back to a nurse case manager and be able to do a dashboard-based exception management. So
Was the idea a software tool that providers could buy and
absolutely,
use?
yeah, and it was a private label model. So we literally at launch we had an AMA version, we had a Merck version, we have a CVS version, and all these large licensees paying a high margin SaaS subscription model, and off we went, and we were doing a scale up, a growth round of equity. I was at JP Morgan in January of 2013, and we were doing a $10 million raise, and it was going really well. But then a couple days later, I get one call and said, instead of investing, we just want to buy this.
Right.
And then another call. So we got 4 calls that just wanted to buy it. And it was a really interesting time.
And were you thinking about that, or was that?
No, we really weren't. But and this is a good conversation to have with any of you that are at this point. When you move from the startup phase, and you've got proof of concept, and then you have real customers, and you're at this point where some call it the growth phase. I call it the breakout phase.
Right.
Now the reality is, if you think you've got a really good idea, there's probably about 10 others that have pretty much the same idea as you. And you might have, if you're just brilliant, you might have a little bit of lead on the rest of the world, but don't kid yourself. A lot of other people will figure out something, unless you've got a drug that's a specific patent that's protecting that. Especially when it comes to software. So then it's a decision about, scale. And at this moment of time, am I better, taking the $10 million and growing as much as I can, as fast as I can, or biting the bullet and becoming a part of a monster capability that has enormous, logistical reach, sales, brand recognition, all those things that come with it. And it was just that kind of moment where, I kind of knew that the market was going to move. There were others that were kind of nipping at our heels. And if these, if I didn't get into one of these big vehicles, then there's a good chance you're just going to get left behind.
Right.
And that's just kind of, it's a tough call, because you can always say, I could have held on and grown it, that much bigger before I sold it. But you certainly can't. I definitely wouldn't look back now, and everything has been so fantastic at Qualcomm. So
you're in Qualcomm. It's another large company compared to a startup. And what was that like, building inside Qualcomm? Because you sold relatively early in that growth stage, and so now you're building it inside Qualcomm. What has that been like?
Both Qualcomm and Microsoft, I would say, were incredibly positive experiences that were fairly unique. It's generally the case where if you get acquired by a company, you're being acquired. Like if you're a healthcare company, you get acquired by J&J, or you get acquired by Medtronic. Those are big healthcare beasts, and you just get kind of chewed up inside them. I'm not sure I would ever survive that, but Microsoft, John and I were like we were the first two physicians in that whole organization. I mean, we were the token doctors in 100,000 employees at Microsoft. So, whatever we said seemed to be taken seriously, for better or worse. And and so we were kind of a startup. We really were a startup. I mean, we were over in Bellevue for the first couple of years, away from the Microsoft campus, and we were just like a startup with the kind of the best of both worlds. We had this huge brand, so anybody would take a meeting with us because it was Microsoft calling, and yet we were in total control over everything we did. The guys up in Redmond, they didn't know anything about healthcare. They just had to take our word for it. So it was really quite wonderful, being a startup, a true startup inside of one of these mega companies. And it ended up the same way with Qualcomm. HealthyCircles was literally, it was almost an acqui-hire. They didn't have anybody with any healthcare domain expertise. And, so we became the healthcare division, and all of the, my general counsel became the general counsel of the Qualcomm team. My marketing person became the chief marketing officer, and so.
How big was the company when you sold?
HealthyCircles?
Yeah, the organization.
It was 35 was the head count.
35, yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll touch on that for a couple of minutes here before talking about connected health as a topic. Sure. And the questions. During that stage, sort of the 0 to 10, right, or the 10 to 20, which maybe some of the entrepreneurs in the audience here can relate to, you've got these primal challenges, right? How do you communicate what you're doing so you can go raise money? How do you go and sell your product to the first really early customers, right? And especially with some of the things you've done, very innovative, different from what's already out there. How do you hire your first 5 or 10 employees? Can you walk through some of those things, and maybe as you went company to company, what you learned and what you did differently over time and what you kept the essence of as well?
It's just such fun stuff. First, like with Healthy Tech, and I'm sure many of you will experience this if you haven't already. We're out of money. We literally, that first 1.5 million. I was paying IDO, and they aren't cheap. And so, we had rent, and it was just a couple of us, but we were out of money, and we were doing the, not answering the phone because you knew who was calling, and it's hard to be out raising money, right, when you're out of money, and frankly, there's some pretty unscrupulous, venture capitalists out of there that'll purposely string you out and delay and play games, knowing that you're getting tight on cash, and then suddenly the terms and the valuation are changing not in your favor. And it's hard and it's painful. And you know, I got interviewed by the Wall Street Journal quite a bit during those times. And one of them, you okay over there? One of them was right after the IPO, and we were the first healthcare startup to go IPO after Sarbanes-Oxley, and that's a whole nother conversation. And so the Wall Street Journal was interviewing me about what it's like being a startup company under Sarbanes-Oxley, and other than saying it sucks really bad, you know, then they went into which is more stressful, being a heart surgeon or being the CEO of a newly publicly traded company. That that's easy. The CEO of a publicly traded company is far more stressful than doing, you know, cardiac surgery. And the reporter was really taken by that and said, you know, challenged me on it. I said, look, in the operating room, you know, I can be in the middle of a heart operation and see something, have the nurse call the radiologist, and she'll hold the phone up to my ear, and I'll say, hey, Bill, I need this patient to have the femoral artery dilated. And you know what? I don't have to get a lawyer involved. I don't have to have a contract. There is an ethical commitment to providing care and doing no harm, and you can trust people. I mean, you know, sure, there's bad apples in the medical profession, but for the most part, you know, physicians and clinicians in general operate in an environment of deep trust and commitment and responsibility to doing good. Conversely, in the business world, I have negotiated, you know, inch-thick, 200-page contracts with multi-billion-dollar, you know, corporations that had dozens of lawyers on both sides of the discussion, and 6 months, 9 months later, purely out of no other reason than financial gain or loss, they were, you know, essentially defaulting or you know, getting out of that contract. So it's you know, trust is really big for me, and that then leads to the second part when it comes to recruiting your executive team, and that to me has probably been the most truly pivotal aspect of everything that I've done.
What will you look for in the very first, you know, people you recruit into your team?
You just heard it. Trust, trust, trust. Integrity, integrity, integrity. People who, you know, you would trust with your life, and they would trust with your life. And you see it in everything, in sports and everything. It's you know, teams that really succeed, they just have the chemistry and the trust in each other, and you know, you are in it together, and you succeed together, and you fail together, and there's no recriminations, and it's just this mutual admiration and mutual respect. You know, and you know, some of the lessons I've learned progressively over the years is you're never perfect in recruiting everybody. Sometimes you think it's the right person, and then it's not. One of the things I learned the hard way is surgeons are very decisive by their nature, and yet it's hard when it comes to people in their lives and their careers, and you hire somebody in a key position, and they're not up to it, or they're not the right chemistry, um, it's very hard. And yet, you know, for the good of the organization, you've got to make this change. And my lesson over the years is we all probably recognize this issue and yet not act on it in the shortest amount of time.
Right.
Obviously, there's employment law issues and things like that now, and you got to document everything before. But the reality is, if you're prepared to, you have to take really, really good care of people who you're firing.
Right.
And again, it's just the right thing to do. Give them, don't be stingy about severance. Don't be, it's not going to kill the business if, and if it does, then you got other issues. But give somebody a generous severance. Make it easy for them to recognize that it's time to move on. But it's also disastrous to a startup company to have somebody in a key role that's not able to contribute and not the right fit, and have that kind of perseverate, longer than necessary.
That's sage advice. And we'll move from the micro to the macro a little bit. So now, zooming out, we talked a little bit about this. You're an optimist around connected health and digital health and where it's going. A lot of the folks are. Where do you see the state of personal connected health and digital health broadly, a decade from now? We're sitting here 10 years from now. What will have finally changed in that period of time?
Well, I'm 20 years into this 30-year journey, so I'm in long already. And when we talk about the Gartner hype cycle,
right.
Many of you know about it. You got the hype phase, and then the disillusion phase, and then kind of the breakout or the stabilization phase and growth. When it comes to digital health and connected health, I think we've seen one hype phase, two hype phases, three hype phases, four hype phases. We've seen a lot of kind of head fakes. I think we're finally done with the head fakes, to be honest with you. And there's a lot of reason to believe that we are at the inception point. 10 years ago, we didn't have electronic medical records.
Right.
There was no place for the data to go. $50 billion in stimulus money helped put EMRs into every hospital and every physician practice. Not that the EMRs are suited for what we're hoping to do with them, but that's a whole nother conversation. But the other things that have happened is really the technology, being able to do so many things in the palm of your hand, tablets, wireless, the transmission of data. I mean, 20 years ago, the idea of even watching a video on your phone was absurd, and here we are today. The other thing is frankly the movement from fee for service to value.
Right.
And
you mentioned there's some new reimbursement now that.
And yeah, I mean, it's taken 20 years, but January 1st of this year, for the first time in the history of American medicine, a doctor can actually get paid for monitoring somebody's blood pressure without actually bringing them in face-to-face to their clinic in order to get paid. So that's a big breakthrough, and so all of these kind of stars are aligning, and I think what we're going to see is, I'll talk about what is the next 10 years. The next 10 years really isn't much about the gadgets and the connectedness. We talk about connected health, and kind of the connectedness is really just plumbing. And the devices are just data generators.
Right.
So the next 10 years is really the profound moment. This is the moment. And the moment over the next 10 years, and you're recording this, we'll be able to play this back, 100 years from now, we will look back at this next 10 years, between 2020 and 2030, as being one of the most profound moments in the history of medicine, in the history of human health, on par with the likes of the introduction of anesthesia in the 1850s, the introduction of antibiotics and immunizations in the turn of the 20th century. And what I'm talking about is not connected health. It's not digital health. It's what connected health and digital health will enable, and that's called intelligent health. The intelligence is really what we're now going to be able to finally do with the digital data. It's actually the data that's going to make all the difference. The data that's going to flip the cost curve. The data that's going to allow us to implement a predictive analytics system in the operating room, just like the autopilot system in the cockpit of a 787 Boeing Dreamliner. That intelligence system in every airplane that we fly in today is flying that plane. The pilots aren't flying that plane. It's the intelligence layer. It's connected. It's got sensors on every engine. The data is streaming into a computer and running hundreds and thousands of simultaneous algorithms and reducing it down to a single display, so the pilot, while he or she is playing a game on their iPad, can look over and say, yeah, everything's good. Right. And that's what needs to happen and is about to happen in the operating room and literally in every facet of healthcare, because we as clinicians have been, frankly, practicing medicine in an antiquated approach that hasn't changed for 100 years, and is, we call it modern medicine, but it's really not smart medicine yet.
I share your enthusiasm for that.
Yeah.
Who's doing it? So, besides Qualcomm, right, which we want to talk about, what
Sure.
are they up to, and is there an industry med tech company, or frankly, just to your comments, who's doing it? Are there 2 or 3 companies that you say, boy, that really impresses me, or they've got it? They're at the tip of the spear for this next wave.
There is a lot of activity in this space, and it's so when this is the whole conversation about big data and analytics. So I want to be clear in kind of the vernacular. The population health and big data has been kind of a buzz phrase and gotten a lot of attention. There's real value there. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm actually talking about is the fact that now with wearables and the ability to plug into all these monitors and sensors and even microphones, we're now able to tap into a stream of real-time data, streaming data out of each human individual. And what we're doing is actually seeing, and we're very involved in establishing these basically 3 legs of the stool collaborations. And these collaborations, you need the technology and basically the data streams, but you need clinical domain expertise that understands the meaning and the correlations of these streaming data sets.
Right.
And then these people over here that are kind of new to the game. And does anybody know who that is? The mathematicians.
Right.
So the pattern recognition, now we're getting, just in the operating room, we're now able to tap into these monitors. Well, guess what? There's 1 million pieces of data coming out of each patient per hour in the operating room and in the intensive care unit. But we as clinicians and nurses and pharmacists, we could never pay attention to 1 million anything. But if we have a mathematician that can basically do a set of pattern recognition.
Data science, right?
It's all about data science.
Right.
And so the FDA, to its credit, has recognized this is the new frontier. I'm actually on the admissions committee for the University of Michigan Medical School. And I couldn't be more excited for undergraduate students who are trying to get into medical school. This is kind of the Missouri land grab. Somebody just fired the gun. And in every category of medicine, there will be predictive algorithms and data science that will be tapping into these streaming sensors and monitors and seeing stuff that we never dreamed of knowing before. And now you have the FDA creating a whole new category called software as a medical device, which is a 510(k) Class 2 designation for predictive algorithms. So now you have a barrier to entry. You can put your Coca-Cola recipe, if you've got a data scientist who found a cool algorithm, you can box it up. All you have to do is tell the FDA what are the data inputs and then what is the output on the other side. And then you have to do clinical trials to show that it's safe and that you have some outcome benefit. And now you got yourself a SaaS model, proprietary 510(k) medical device that is pure margin. Nice business. There's a lot of investors out starting to recognize this opportunity. And frankly, a lot of big companies, Qualcomm being one of them, Google, Philips, Medtronic, we're all,
Right.
a lot of us are all hiring data scientists and starting to basically aggregate data sets and find pattern recognition. Even Fitbit is sitting on data from 30 million wearables, and now they can, say, well, all that data, how does it correlate to rheumatoid arthritis or to diabetes? And I know there's some privacy issues in the news lately, but it's going to change kind of human health like we haven't seen.
Transformational way.
No question.
We're down to our last two questions.
All right.
And so the first one is our top voted question. What's your advice for a young professional who wants to pursue a career in healthcare but doesn't have a clinical background? So, if you're giving advice to somebody going into business school right now, not medical school or, whatever else, but they want to go into healthcare, what advice would you give them?
So I have 5 kids, 2 of them out of college, 1 of them still in college. The advice, no matter what you want to study, and there's a great Wall Street Journal article that I gave to each of them, whether you want to be a marketing major, a business major, or you've got to learn what it means to code. And it's a great Wall Street Journal article. It's very compelling. Basically programming and coding, and I'm not a coder, but through the years I understand the whole thing, soup to nuts, and the process and the language and so forth. But now knowing all that I know, that data science side of it and the kind of data science and analytics, wow, is that powerful.
Right.
And you don't have to have the clinical acumen, but you see these data scientists now partnering up with the clinical institutions, and frankly, we're in negotiations with a company right now where it's a PhD mathematician that started this company, and it is an incredibly powerful predictive analytics platform that has enormous healthcare opportunities. And you're just going to see this whole thing flourish.
And you know, that takes me to my last question, and there's maybe two parts to it. The audience question is, besides Qualcomm, no, I'm sorry, you sold your company to Qualcomm and you're still there, right? What has kept you there as opposed to starting another company? And the second part I'll add is, when you think about your own next 10 years, right?
Sure.
You know, what do you want to work on, and what's next for you at Qualcomm, outside of Qualcomm as well?
So what's typical when you do an M&A transaction, and you know, I'm now the acquirer, but I've been the acquiree, is a handcuff,
Right.
for the key leadership in any acquisition, and it's usually that, you know, everybody tries to negotiate a 3-year handcuff. I always agree to no more than a 2-year handcuff, because you know, I want to have the ability to get out of there, you know, and do something new.
Right.
And here I am 5 years later, so the over and under has just been crushed on all the people that know me. And it was because of 2 reasons. One is this thing called a retention package that keeps coming at me when my first 2 years were going to expire, and you know, so you know, they have to make it worth your while to stay. But it really wasn't about the retention package. It was really about the ability to keep doing, you know, what was fun and what I'm passionate about, and building something. And as long as it's fun and we can, you know, make these things happen, and it's not constrained by kind of the mothership.
Right.
Because those can be hard. Even if you're a startup inside of one of these big things, there's still a lot of nonsense that are just kind of big company practices and policies, and you have to suffer through those. But it's been a great ride. You know, there's obviously a lot of activity related to Qualcomm in the news over the past few weeks and months, and who knows? All options are open for consideration.
Well, it's been a great conversation. Thank you again, James.
Thank you.